Thank you. An important nomination at a moment where this country faces very significant national security threats. As I commented yesterday, the President came to us yesterday asking us to authorize the use of force, and I think we should do that. I'm not necessarily sure that we should do it in the way he's asked us to do it. I think it should be a pretty straightforward authorization, and here's what it should say. It should say we authorize the President of the United States to destroy ISIL, to defeat them militarily. And it's up to the Commander-in-Chief to decide the right way in which to do that. Now, I think I have very serious concerns and very serious reservations about our current strategy when it comes to ISIS. I'm not sure it's sufficient. I think it's a strategy that will contain them, but it will not defeat them. In fact, ISIS is now popping up. For example, they have a very significant hub in Libya. They now have a very significant presence in Benghazi. Just a few days ago, they carried out an attack in Tripoli. And now we're hearing media reports that ISIS has a presence in Afghanistan, perhaps even terrorist training camps. So they continue to grow their affiliates, they continue to grow their presence, and we need an authorization of use of force that allows them to defeat them anywhere in the world where they are to be found. And I hope that the President's suggestion has been well received in terms of we thank him for submitting one. But now it's the job of the Senate to do its job, to write one of its own. And it may reflect many of the things the President wants, but what I believe it should reflect more than anything else is that we authorize him to defeat ISIS, no matter what it takes and no matter how long it takes. And if we have problems with the strategy, there are different ways to address it. And I do have problems with this strategy, and that should be addressed. But Mr. Carter's nomination comes at another important moment, and that is when in that same region of the world, one of America's strongest allies and its very existence is under attack. And of course, I'm talking about Israel, the Jewish state, an extraordinary story in the history of the world. Here's a country founded after the end of World War II as a homeland for the Jewish people, so that never again would they have nowhere to go if they faced the sorts of oppression, the sort of genocide that they faced during the Holocaust. And since then, the Jewish state has had an extraordinary story. From an economic perspective, it is a vibrant first world country, first-rate economy. And what's most interesting about it is this is not a country with oil. This is not a country with vast supplies of natural gas. This is not a country that is an agricultural superpower. And yet it is a world-class economy, providing prosperity and upward mobility to millions of its people. And it's done so on the basis of innovation. There's a very good book written by recently called Startup Nation that talks about the extraordinary story of Israel. It's also a very vibrant democracy. In fact, to observers of Israeli politics, they often joke perhaps a little too vibrant. They have heated debates, but it's a democracy. So what we have here is a democratic nation with a vibrant free enterprise economy in the middle of the Middle East. Israel is everything we want that region of the world to become. We wish every nation in that region was a real democracy, a vibrant one. We wish every nation in that part of the world had a first-rate economy that provided upward mobility to everyone. And we wish every nation in the Middle East was as strong an ally of the United States as Israel has been. This is the extraordinary story of this small but important nation. And this country must continue to be their strongest ally in the world. But they face extraordinary threats to their safety, to their security, to their existence. It begins with what I believe is a concerted effort around the world, including in American academia, including in the universities of this very country, to delegitimize Israel's right to exist, and its right to exist as a Jewish state. And it's an outrage. It continues with the growth of anti-Semitism all over the world, increasingly in Europe. Every day we see stories of a mass exodus as more and more Jews are leaving Europe because of the growth in anti-Semitism. We saw what happened in Paris. Not just the attack that happened in that newspaper and in that magazine, but how Jews were deliberately targeted for death by terrorists. It was not a random attack, Mr. President. It was a deliberate effort to target Jews. It was a deliberate act of violence and the furtherance of anti-Semitism. In every international body in the world, Israel is often the target of scorn and criticism without any consideration whatsoever to what its enemies intend to do to them. And now, perhaps the greatest risk of all is to its very existence, from the threat of an Iranian nuclear program. Now, I, like everybody else, I wish that I woke up tomorrow morning to the news that the Ayatollah had come to a sensus and realized that Iran cannot continue down its path. They'd given up their nuclear weapon ambition. They'd given up sponsoring terrorism all over the world. They'd given up their anti-Israeli, anti-Semitic rhetoric. They'd given up oppressing their own people. But I know that's not going to happen, because Iran is not governed by a normal leader, the way you and I would consider a leader of a nation. Iran is governed by a radical Shia cleric. A radical Shia cleric that does not believe that he is the head of Iran. He believes he is the head of all Islam everywhere in the world. Iran is where he lives. Iran is where he is based. But Iran is not what he believes is his domain. He believes every Muslim on the planet, under the sun, is under his control and under his leadership. But here's the scariest thing he believes. He believes that it is his job to trigger an apocalyptic showdown between the Muslim and non-Muslim world, because that will bring about the emergence of the 13th Imam, the hidden Imam, the Mahdi as they call it, who will then come and govern the entire world under the flag of Islam, his version of radical Islam. Now you may say that stuff sounds a little far-fetched. That is what he believes. That is what he passionately and legitimately believes. So when you have someone who wants to trigger an apocalyptic showdown between the Muslim and non-Muslim world, when you have someone who says they want to destroy the state of Israel, wipe it off the face of the earth, and that person is trying to acquire a nuclear weapons capability, you better be very concerned. And you better conclude that that is an unacceptable risk for us to take. But it's particularly scary for Israel, because they are closer to Iran than we are. They are in their crosshairs, both verbally and militarily. Now, the administration would have us believe that we're in the midst of this negotiation that hopefully will delay the Iranian nuclear program or extend the amount of time that they would need to break out. Let me break it to everyone. They're not going to break out. They're going to sneak out. They will concoct some sort of excuse at some point in the future as to why they need a nuclear program, nuclear weapons program. Let me begin by saying Iran is an oil-rich nation. They have no need for civilian nuclear power, but if they want one, they can have it like most of the other countries in the world do, by importing enriched uranium or reprocessed plutonium and using that for their reactors for peaceful purposes. But instead, they insist on the ability to enrich and reprocess. And there's only one reason why you would insist on that, is because you want the infrastructure necessary to one day build a weapon when you decide you need it. But don't take my word for it. That is not the only thing that they are doing. There are two other aspects of their program that aren't even being discussed. The first is they continue to develop long-range rockets. Now, why do you need intercontinental missiles? Why do you need long-range rockets? You don't need them for conventional purposes. You don't put a conventional warhead. You don't spend all the time and energy and money that it takes to build that capacity to bomb someone with a conventional weapon. There's only one reason why you build long-range rockets such as those, and that's to put a nuclear warhead on them. That's not being discussed in these negotiations, and they continue to make unabated progress towards their long-range rocket capabilities. And the other is a weapon design. The three things you need for a nuclear weapon program: a weapon design, the long-range rockets, and the ability to enrich and reprocess. They're already building the rockets. The weapon design you can literally buy from dozens of people around the world who will sell it to you. And the reprocessing, even under the deal the president is asking for, if it went down exactly the way the president is asking for it, they would still keep all the infrastructure, all the things that it takes to enrich to weapons grade. They would have all the equipment, all the scientists, all of the infrastructure. And here's one more point. Iran has always had a secret component to their nuclear program. Always have had some secret component to their program. And I would venture to guess that right now they have a secret component to their program as well that we do not know about. So that's why I have little hope in this deal. But that's why Prime Minister Netanyahu is so concerned about the deal. You see, he doesn't have the luxury of living in illusion. He doesn't have the luxury of pretending that somehow we can work this out as if somehow we're negotiating with Luxembourg here or Belgium. He knows the neighborhood he lives in, and he knows his enemy. He knows their true nature. He knows their true intentions. And it is his obligation not just to protect his people, but to fight for that nation's very existence. So he has chosen to come before the Congress at the invitation of the Speaker. And I am glad that he has accepted that invitation. And I think we owe him the courtesy to hear what he has to say. I want you to go back and look at the United Nations roll call votes. Time and again, when the interests of this country are being challenged around the world, I want you to see how many times Israel is one of the few, and often one of the only countries, that votes with the United States of America in that international forum. I want you to see all the times that the Israelis have stood with America on issue after issue around the world. I also want you to think what it says about us as a nation if we are not prepared to make it very clear that before anything else, we are the friends of our allies. What does it say to our other allies around the world? To other nations and other parts of the world who are counting on the American security guarantee for their own existence and their own security? What does it say to Japan and to South Korea and to our allies in NATO? When the United States, if the United States is prepared to create daylight between us and the state of Israel. And let me tell you, that's exactly the message people are going to get, that there is a division between us and Israel. If in fact members of Congress carry through on their threat to boycott the Prime Minister's speech before Congress on the 3rd of March. If you boycott this speech, if a significant number of members of the Senate and the House boycott that speech, that message will be heard to Israel's enemies, but also by our allies. And the message will be twofold. One, that America is no longer firmly on the side of Israel as it once was. And two, that America is an unreliable ally. Look what they just did to Israel. I think everyone has a right to go to any speech they want or not to attend a speech. But I hope my colleagues that are thinking about not going will reconsider. You may not like the way this went down. You may not like the fact that the Speaker did it the way he did it. That's your choice. But I want you to think about the implications beyond that. I want you to think about the implications that this leaves on Israel. I want you to think about the message that this sends to Israel's enemies. Because what we have seen decade after decade is that any time Israel's enemies get the perception that somehow America is no longer as committed to Israel's security as it once was, it emboldens them to attack Israel. And Israel has no shortage of enemies that want to not just attack them, but destroy them. We've seen what Hamas has done. We've seen what Hezbollah has done. We've seen what Iran wants to do and is doing. And if you boycott the speech, if a significant numbers of members of Congress boycott that speech, you are sending an incredibly powerful message to Israel's enemies. So I hope you'll reconsider. I don't question anyone's commitment on this issue. I believe that there are supporters of Israel who won't attend the speech because they think it's disrespectful to the president. This is a lot bigger than that. We're talking about the existence of this nation. We're talking about whether people in that nation will survive in 20 years or 15 years. That's how important and monumental this moment is. Now, I'm not claiming that by you not attending the speech, somehow that's going to lead to Israel's destruction. I am claiming that if you boycott the speech, you're sending a message to Israel's enemies that could embolden them. And I hope they'll reconsider that position. I find it, quite frankly, outrageous that reports are that the White House has asked members of Congress to boycott the speech. I find it outrageous that the Vice President of the United States, has decided to boycott that speech. I find it outrageous, for example, that on the one hand, we are more than glad to send administration officials at the highest levels to sit down and meet repeatedly with the highest ranking officials that Iran will send. But our strongest allies, prime ministers coming to Washington and they won't even meet with him? One of our strongest allies, prime minister, wants to speak before the Congress and they won't even attend the speech? What do you think the headlines are going to be read as in Iran by the terrorists in Gaza, by the terrorists in Judea and Samaria, by the terrorists in all parts of the world, like in Lebanon, who want to destroy Israel? What do you think they're going to read into that? What they're going to read into it, unfortunately, is that somehow the Congress's commitment to the future security of Israel is not as strong as it once was. And I fear what the implications of that will be. And we should not take this lightly. I can think of no nation on earth that needs our help more right now than Israel. And I can think of no people on earth that deserve our support more than theirs. As I said earlier, they are a reliable, strong, committed ally of this nation. We have strong links to them on a personal, cultural, political, and economic level. They have stood by us time and again in international forums when America's interests have been challenged. They are everything we want the Middle East to look like in the future: free, prosperous, democratic, aligned with America, peace-loving, desirous of a better future. What more do you want? What more could they do? What else could they be for us to be any stronger an ally of theirs than we should be or are right now? And yet, there are people that are talking about boycotting the speech, the protest, because their feelings are hurt, because they're upset about the way it went down, because they don't like the way it was scheduled, because it's disrespectful to the president. You have the right to voice your concerns, but don't do this to an ally. Don't do this to a nation that is as threatened today as it has ever been at any time in its existence. Don't do this to a people that are in the crosshairs of multiple terrorist groups with the capability of attacking them. Don't do this to a nation whose civilians are terrorized by thousands of rockets launched against them at a moment's notice. Don't do this to a country that's facing down the threat of a nuclear weapon annihilating them off the face of the earth. Don't do this to a people that are being stigmatized all over the world, even as we speak, who are being oppressed. Don't do this to a country that in forum after forum has become the subject of delegitimization as people argue that somehow Israel's right to exist is not real. Don't do this to them. I hope my colleagues will reconsider their decision to not attend. This is an important speech. And I hope that the Prime Minister, it's his choice, obviously. He must always act in the best interest of his nation and his people. But I hope he will speak to us on the 3rd of March. And I hope that he will speak to us clearly. I hope that through his speech, he will open the eyes of this Congress and the American people that this is not child's play. That what Iran intends to have is not just a nuclear weapon to destroy Israel, but ultimately to terrorize the world. I hope that he will speak to us bluntly about the true nature of this threat. I know there's a lot going on in the world, but there is no greater threat to the long-term security of the planet than the Iranian nuclear ambition. No people and no nation on earth know that better than the people of Israel, and no leader on earth understands that better than Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I think after years of commitment to this alliance, after the bravery that he has shown in his time in office, of the bravery that the Jewish people of Israel have shown in defending their nation's right to exist, when attacked multiple times throughout its history and even to this modern day, they deserve our support, our unambiguous support. Of course there are differences between allies. There always have been and there always will be. But if we won't stand for Israel, who will we stand for? If the United States of America will not defend its ally, who will we defend? What message do we send to our alliances across the planet? And what message do we send to our enemies and Israel's enemies? And so I hope that cooler heads will prevail. I hope that members of the House and Senate who have announced that they're boycotting will reconsider. And I hope we will all be there, if we can, to hear what the Prime Minister has to say the first week of March.